Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm Eric Dawson, manager of the McClung Historical Collection, and we're glad you joined us today. Before we start, I want to tell you about a few events coming up. Tomorrow night here in the auditorium at 6 p.m., Tori Olson will be here talking about his work with the video game Red Dead Redemption. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it seems to be getting a lot of attention. He was on WUOT yesterday talking about it. It's been written up in national press, and it's a really interesting look at how video games interact with historical accuracy and not. And of course, this weekend, our big event is the History Hootenanny. All day Saturday, starting around 10 a.m. There's going to be events going on here all day. We're going to have live music, children's activities, walking tours, book sale, and of course, we get to take over the Tennessee Theater for a day. So we're going to be showing films all day over there, documentaries with related locally historic content, and capping off the day at 5 p.m. with Wyatt Ellis and his bluegrass band. And the theme this year is country music, and that's because the exhibit of Carl and Pearl Butler, if you haven't seen it, you have about, 5 days now to see it. It's coming down this weekend. And so he sort of built it around that. And Wyatt Ellis, 14-year-old mandolin prodigy, I'm sure you've heard of him. He's doing a special set of all Knoxville-related music. So this won't be a regular concert, and it's his first time playing the Tennessee Theater, so we're all pretty excited about that. We're also excited about today's presentation, because when I look around and see who's here, most, if not all of you, have some connection or relation with this organization that Ethan will be talking about. And I'm sure most of you know Ethan Fullwood, the newish executive director of Jubilee Community Arts. He's a biological anthropologist by training and has harbored a long fascination with the music, traditions, culture, and history of the region. He's also a practitioner of traditional music and dance, and occasionally some more modern forms of dance, if you catch him out at the right time. But he's going to talk about the history of this fine organization, and I welcome Ethan Fullwood.
Hello. So I guess preparatory remarks. One is, so this is very much a work in progress for me, learning more about Jubilee Community Arts, because I took over in December, and I have the sensation I'm talking to a lot of people who know more about this than I do, but we'll see how it goes. And the other thing I guess what I tried to focus on in this talk is the way JCA connected to kind of broader events in Knoxville and in the region and the country, and less about kind of the institutional history, this director, this director, this director. I just feel like maybe that's more interesting to people than the sort of inside baseball stuff. Okay. So Jubilee Community Arts emerges out of the milieu of the 1970s, and in particular a response to sort of the three big crises that were dominating a lot of public attention, a lot of political energy and activist energy in that decade. One is the sort of the crisis of the inner cities, right? You were having depopulation of the inner cities due to white flight, the beginnings of deindustrialization, increase in drug use and crime, and sort of the livability of the inner city was a major crisis. And so urban renewal was a response to this, but it also created problems, right? It was destroying incumbent neighborhoods and stuff. You have student unrest. So this is the beginning of the Vietnam War era, beginning in the middle of the Vietnam War era. You're also having unrest around issues of racial injustice and so forth. And there's a real sense that the students had gotten out of control, right? among some groups. So universities were trying universities and people of kind of goodwill or whatever were trying to figure out how to manage student demands while maintaining the function of universities, and there's a variety of responses to that, from listening to the students to smashing the students. And then also Appalachia. So this is a period where Appalachia and rural and really white poverty, so Appalachia at this time is kind of used almost synonymously with whiteness, right, is dominating public attention in a way that it hadn't for previous decades. This is the era of the war on poverty and all of that. And you see that they actually, a lot of these intersect. So do I have a little pointer arrow? Is that possible on this PowerPoint?
Yeah, you can use that arrow, actually, Ethan, the one that you're using.
I've got a little laser pointer here. There you go.
There you go.
Excellent. Okay, so I made a Venn diagram because these actually intersect, and they intersect in ways that are kind of surprising, right? So inner cities and students, right? students are often in cities, so they're responding to urban problems, and universities are creating urban problems. So this is something you definitely see in Fort Sanders, right? This residential neighborhood is becoming a student neighborhood because of the growth of UT and because of UT's actions itself, and kind of just destroying large parts of that neighborhood and the other residential neighborhoods that are now UT campus that used to be residential neighborhoods. You have intersections between student interest in Appalachia and rural poverty. And you also have a lot of overlap between Appalachia and the inner cities, which seem like opposite concepts. But we're on the tail end of this sort of the hillbilly highway era. So it's the parallel to the more famous Great Migration of Black Southerners to the north. You have a lot of migration of white Southerners to the north at the same time. Slightly different reasons. They're not escaping Jim Crow, but they're looking for economic opportunity, right? And this creates these neighborhoods in northern cities, places like uptown Chicago, over the Rhine in Cincinnati, that are densely populated, relatively low income, and thought of at least as being sort of hillbilly ghettos, as being dominated by white Southerners, whether or not they exactly were or not. There's a perception that there's this large kind of undigestible population of white Southerners that are often called Appalachians, even if they're not maybe from Appalachia precisely. And that creates a lot of interest in addressing the needs of this population amongst northern city governments and social reformers in these places. So there's this sort of move to try to understand Appalachian culture in order to serve these displaced Appalachian populations in northern cities. So all these things are intersecting, and right in the middle of the intersection is an organization called the Epworth Ministry. So the Epworth Ministry is really the kind of the focal point of this talk, because that's the thing out of which Jubilee Community Arts grows, and a lot of other organizations. And it's founded, as I said, at the intersection of these three crises. So you've got an inner city neighborhood in Knoxville, the Fort Sanders neighborhood, which we don't maybe think of as inner city, but certainly was thought of at the time as inner city, and also has as its catchment area Mechanicsville and Western Avenue and other kind of parts of urban Knoxville. The student population at UT, which had quite a lot of protest and unrest in the 60s and early 70s, and then of course a location within Appalachia. So Renfro Sproul, who wrote a dissertation about this ministry, really makes that very clear in his explanation of what the justification for the Epworth Ministry was. All right. So what was the Epworth Ministry? So the Epworth Ministry was 4 churches coming together. So Presbyterians, and the Presbyterians had a presence previously in Fort Sanders, a congregation that led into this called the Fort Sanders Presbyterian Church. Episcopalians, who didn't have I don't think had a church in Fort Sanders at the time, but got interested. Methodists, who had the Epworth United Methodist Church, and really institutionally, the Epworth Ministry was created by the Methodists. So it was the Methodists reaching out to these other groups. So that's why it's called Epworth, I assume, is because it kept the name of that United Methodist Church. And then Catholics. So I don't know exactly what institutional role, like the Diocese of, I guess it was the Diocese of Nashville at the time. I don't think there was a Diocese of Knoxville. But I don't know what the institutional role it had, but I think it probably gave some money. And then there were 2 groups of people who were involved. The Catholic Student Center, which briefly occupied the building that becomes Laurel Theater. And then this group called Focus, Federation of Communities in Service, which was the descendant of another group called the Glen Mary Sisters. So ecumenical ministries like this is not the first one, and this is not the first time these 4 churches have come together. That this was kind of in the air in the late 60s and early 70s. This idea that the mainline churches were failing. They were failing to reach out to people. The congregations were shrinking. They were leaving the inner cities and going to the suburbs. And so there was a need to combine forces and try to do particularly social service delivery. So that's what a lot of these ecumenical ministries are really oriented toward, not so much catechism or whatever, but delivering services to people, and particularly in cities. So parallel to the Epworth Ministry, you have 2 organizations that have a similar time frame and a similar mission in some ways. So Apple Shop up in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and Highlander Folk School originally in Grundy County, Tennessee, and then moved around Knoxville, and then now it's in Newmarket. So there's intersections of people, and there's intersections of interest in those groups. They're not really part of Epworth Ministry, but they're sort of in the area, and there's a lot back and forth. So out of the Epworth Ministry, you get organizations that are still with us today. So first off, the one we're focused on, Jubilee Community Arts, comes out of Epworth Ministry. But also the East Tennessee Community Design Center, still around, still important, comes out of Epworth Ministry. The Knoxville Food Co-op, that was interesting when I learned that. So Three Rivers Market, so its descendant, or its ancestor rather, is a project of the ministry, the ecumenical ministry. Laurel High School, which is not around anymore, but was until 2010, I think, when it closed. And then there was an Epworth congregation that continued to meet up until COVID. So it had a long afterlife. All right, so that's my chart. I'm an old anatomy professor. We love charts. Now, on to pictures. So these are the two congregations that sort of fed into the Epworth ministry. This is a little prehistory. So Epworth United Methodist Church and the Fort Sanders Presbyterian Church. So the Epworth Church began as a Sunday school project of a woman who was at Church Street Methodist, working with the woolen mills, which became, that's the one that became Appalachian Mills. Anyway, it's a textile mill in town. Sort of grew and eventually moved into a church building in Fort Sanders that was not at the current site, and then moved again in 1907 to the lot that became the Epworth United Methodist Church, that was part of the Epworth ministry in 1907. There was another church before that called the Ramsey Church, and then that church was rebuilt, is what all the descriptions say. It seems like it was essentially a new building. So the upshot is the building that you see today is basically a building from 1929, I think, because it was tripled in size. All the architectural features are basically from that building. So that's probably the most plausible place to date that building. And then that congregation in the 60s started to do some interesting stuff. So they got really involved in social justice and social service delivery stuff. So they started having talks about the UN that they would host. There was a Poor People's March that came through, and this church was one of the supply centers for that in the late 60s. And they developed a plan to tear down the church building and build a new church. And you can see this is the design they had in 1969, kind of a modernist, kind of UFO style church like you'd see out in West Knoxville. Probably a lot of those built in that era. And then build an apartment building that would be connected to it, and they would have offices in the apartment building. They would have people live there, and it would be like, I guess, supportive housing or something. This is just from newspaper articles. Is all I can get. Is all I know. And I get the feeling that the building was in bad shape too, because the congregation actually abandoned it in '69 and moved to 1539 Laurel, which is if you know where the Laurel Theater is, it's the house across the street. So that was where the Epworth United Methodist Church was meeting in 1969. That didn't happen, obviously. So I assume what happened is they came up with this ecumenical idea, and that replaced this other idea to tear it down and build an apartment building and a new church and all this other stuff. But anyway, there's a clear trend within that Epworth United Methodist Church towards a more social service-oriented mission and away from sort of just being a traditional residential church, which makes sense, because this is the changes that are happening in that neighborhood in the 60s. You're moving from a residential neighborhood to a student-oriented neighborhood. The other church in the area is Fort Sanders Presbyterian. So this is the church that is the Laurel Theater today. So it's a congregation that formed in 1895. So this is 2 years before the city of Knoxville annexes West Knoxville. So this is West Knoxville still is its own little city, right? Its own little suburb, and it was called. So the thing we call Fort Sanders now was called West Knoxville. And the congregation, they got George Barber, famous Knoxville architect, to design a church building that was built largely by members of the congregation themselves, actually, on the plot that it's still on now. Obviously, not a whole lot of drama to that church's history, really. And then the congregation dissolves in 1965, and there's a little bit of drama here. So, what the conventional story is that it was just a shrinking congregation, just like the same thing, just like the Epworth Church, that the neighborhood was changing, all that sort of stuff. Apparently, Bill Daniel. There's a student paper that I found in the archives up there, where Bill Daniels tells the kid who wrote the paper that they had been involved in civil rights stuff, civil rights activity, and the presbytery was mad about that, and that's why they closed the church. So who knows? Maybe different stories. So the most interesting thing about that church architecturally, other than George Barber, is probably the windows. So originally it originally had 3 large stained glass windows. So there's a north-facing one that has like a Jesus and a little lamb and some children. And that was dedicated to the children of the congregation. There's an east elevation window, which is still there, that is dedicated to a man named John Coyle. Probably no one has ever heard of John Coyle because he was a farmer in Greene County who really only left some census records. But I looked him up one time. I tried to figure out who John Coyle is. So John Coyle was, again, he was just a farmer in Greene County. I'm sure, good guy, I don't know. But he had several children, and one of them was this man named Samuel Coyle. And Samuel Coyle was the minister of Fort Sanders Presbyterian Church when the congregation formed and when they built the church. And so it was dedicated to his father, and it was donated by his mother. So that's why it's John Coyle. And Samuel Coyle had an interesting history. So he left the Fort Sanders Presbyterian Church to become president of Tusculum College, and was president there for a few years, and then got tired of academia, I guess, and went to be a minister in Middle Tennessee and Lebanon, and then became president of Cumberland University, so didn't stay away, and died in St. Louis. The other window is the more historically interesting one. A lot of people probably know this story. So it was dedicated to the soldiers who fought at the Battle of Fort Sanders on both sides. So the reason it's called Fort Sanders Presbyterian Church was not because that was the name of the neighborhood. It wasn't the name of the neighborhood then. It was actually within the boundaries of the original Fort Sanders. So they named it for the fort, literally the fort. And the window was donated by soldiers who were stationed at Camp Poland, which was a training camp for soldiers going to the Spanish-American War. And there's different stories. Either it was just generally the soldiers there. I heard one story, I think Brent told me this, so I don't know where you got it, that the soldiers had gone on a spree downtown, and this was their punishment, was to raise money for this window. There's another story that it was actually soldiers who were members of the congregation who donated it, so I don't know. But soldiers from that congregation, and actually had an inscription on it, Camp Poland, 1898, whatever. And some kind of a dedication to soldiers on both sides, although I've never read any text of what that dedication was. And this is an interesting example of how memory works. Several people, I've heard, will say that it had crossed U.S. and Confederate flags. It did not. It had 2 federal flags. So memory's a tricky thing. So that window was destroyed in a fire, which we'll talk about the fire. But it's on the west side of the building. So the third group that has interesting history to talk about, or the third sort of lead-in, are the Glen Mary Sisters. So the Glen Mary Sisters were a group of religious women, nuns, who formed in 1941 in Glendale, Ohio, which is a suburb now or exurb of Cincinnati, but it was kind of rural Ohio then. And they started doing social service work in the rural Midwest, and eventually, I don't know all their history, but eventually they ended up doing a lot more work in the South and in Appalachia, and in these Appalachian communities in northern cities. So they're at that intersection. So they're doing work in uptown Chicago, which is this Appalachian neighborhood, and in Southwest Virginia. So they have a center in Big Stone Gap for a long time. And I think by the 60s, I guess they're getting frustrated with the constraints of the Diocese of Cincinnati and sort of the Catholic hierarchy, and they're wanting to work, because I imagine if you're a nun working in Southwest Virginia, right, you're like the only Catholic they've ever seen. So having to wear a habit and be an openly religious figure like that is probably actually a hindrance to your work. So they formed this secular organization called Federation of Communities in Service, which is most of the former Glen Mary Sisters. And I think some of them stay in orders and some of them don't. They make different decisions. But basically they formed this group as a sort of a secular group to continue their work in the places that the Glen Mary Sisters were working. And a lot of their work from the beginning was arts. So this is a cool picture of a nun teaching a woman to play dulcimer in Detroit. I think it's the perfect summary of the Glen Mary Sisters. So Marie Cirillo is a famous Glen Mary Sister, a Focus member, former Glen Mary Sister Focus person from this area. She worked in Claiborne County for a long time and formed this Clear Fork Community Center. But another person, Margaret Gregg, we have her tapestry here, was important in the formation of Epworth, as she'll come up later. One story about the Glen Mary Sisters I found interesting. There's a newspaper account of a Glen Mary sister, this is in the late 40s, I think, going home to visit her parents, and it was in California. And I don't know this is necessarily anything she said, but the newspaper begins by talking about how she came back from working with rural early Americans, right? Sort of a ridiculous thing to say. She didn't have a time machine. These weren't early Americans; they were exact contemporaries. But that was in the air, right? That's how people kind of thought about Appalachia in the mid-century, is that these were people kind of lost in time, and that going to work with these populations, you were in some way helping them kind of come up to modernity, but also we owed something to them because they were our like contemporary ancestors, right? As Berea College guy said. So I don't know, kind of the ambivalence of Appalachian identity in the mid-century. Okay, so the Epworth Ministry. So Epworth Ministry forms in 1969. So it's that cooperative project that the Methodists bring to the table that Epworth UMC Church, United Methodist Church, 5 houses, I think that's right. I think it's 5. It's a little hard to get the geography down, but it seems like they had 5 houses that they owned in the area. And then they paid Renfro Sproul, who was as a staff member. Presbyterians gave the church, and some money eventually, but initially just the church. Episcopalians, Bill Daniels, who became the director of Jubilee Community Arts, first director. And then the Catholics, I guess, money, and then the Student Center with John the 23rd, I think is his name. John the 23rd Student Center was sort of involved, and then the Focus people. And this is where we're talking about, and again, the geography is a little bit fuzzy from sources. So this is as best as I can tell. If anyone has, I welcome audience participation because, as I said, a lot of you probably know more than I do about this. So if anyone can correct my map. But what we're looking at here, so we're looking south. So this is the Epworth United Methodist Church. It's now it's called Christ Chapel. So that was, and it was called in the era of the Epworth Ministry the Jubilee Center. So this is really the bigger of the two venues, and it was the place where the bigger concerts happened, where the Jubilee Center, or the Jubilee festivals happened. And you can see it on, well, that's not a poster. When you see a poster, you can see it on the posters. The front of this is prominently displayed. This is what's now the Laurel Theater, so that was the Fort Sanders Presbyterian Church. And then the interim was also part of the project. So this house I know, and I think there was probably a house here that was destroyed, at least one. So these were also part of it. There was a house here, which in what's now this apartment complex, but there was an address here, 1522 Laurel, where the Methodists had a house that they used as a coffee shop. So that was part of it. And then I assume the intervening house too. I don't really know though. And I think these buildings too, but I don't know. This is the Laurel High School building, I believe. So this was the smaller one. It was a smaller one. Okay. So yeah, I don't know about this one. Maybe I included them in error.
And the house on our left, the second house over from the old Jubilee Center, was Bill Daniels.
Okay. So this one.
No, next one over, I think.
Okay.
I don't know about the intermediate.
And there's a description of a white. Rich Kirby wrote a Metropulse letter to the editor where he talked about a White House that was across the street from the Jubilee Center. So maybe that was over here. I don't know. But also people's memories sometimes are not exact, so who knows.
I think it was behind, if I remember. In between. My memory's gone. Anybody remember where the White House was?
Heard of it, but it was gone by the time I moved here.
Yeah, and so there's definitely one example of fuzzy geography. So Christ Chapel, who owns it now? So that's what happens. We're skipping ahead, but that's what happens to this building. It's sold to this other church called Christ Chapel. They're a charismatic interdenominational church. In 1981, I think, is when the sale is completed. But they talk about the history of the building, and they say that in the 60s it was a coffee house. That it had been used as a hippie coffee house. I don't think that's true. I don't think it was ever used. I think it was a church right up until the end. But I think what they're talking about is the 1522 house was the coffee house. So this geography gets a little bit muddled. Okay. Also, there's a murder story. I don't know. Maybe someone. We'll get to it later. But I have a suspicion that maybe the murder was here and not here. But anyway. Okay. Okay, so what was the Epworth Ministry doing? So this is really surprising to me when I read about this, because I think Jubilee Community Arts is an arts organization, right? But a lot of what they were doing was social service stuff. So they had a halfway house. So in that 1533, in that house there, that was a halfway house for about a year. And they host a lot of drug treatment programs. There's a methadone clinic that was started, I guess, around the same time, and actually it did last longer than Epworth Ministry itself did. So that was another of the outgrowths, although I don't know how long it lasts. There's methadone clinics in Knoxville now, but I don't know if they have anything to do with this. Another big initiative was school programs, so our educational programs for children. So they had summer programs, they had a preschool, they had after-school programs, and eventually that school project coalesces into the thing they call the the Laurel School, and then which is originally preschool and elementary, but it becomes Laurel High School. So Laurel High School's genesis is from the educational programs that were in the part of the Epworth ministry. And these are really interesting to read about. So this is a cool write-up in the News Sentinel that's very, very positive. So it got a little positive press in the early years. They talk about how it's experimental, it's very like unstructured. Students are just allowed to sort of choose what they want to do and follow their passions. And there's a lot of arts stuff and crafts, and there's like blacksmithing, all kinds of stuff that's being done, which I understand was Laurel High School was that was their model too up until the end. It was very sort of unstructured and sort of a place for students who didn't fit into the rigors not rigors, but the constraints of traditional schooling.
That mentions Paul McLeod there.
Yeah. Hands for the.
I wonder if that's Meg's father. Meg was early.
Yeah, there's a lot of. I don't know any of these.
And there's a lot of staff in the early years. Like I think some of them were paid, some of them weren't. So this was a big concern. I mean, there was a lot of money involved from the churches, I assume, to support all these programs. Another big focus was neighborhood revitalization in Fort Sanders. So Fort Sanders was, this kind of changing, declining, in a way, neighborhood in the era. And the Brent Sproul and Bill Daniels both talk in articles about sort of wanting to bring a community sense back to Fort Sanders through the Jubilee festivals, which we'll mention later, and also these really kind of ambitious development projects. So there was this plan, and it's described in 1970 in the Sentinel, to create a park and then connect all the different houses that Epworth owned and then the churches and make this kind of like compound, really, that would be a center for community activity. Obviously, this hasn't happened, but that was an early plan. And out of that stuff is what East Tennessee Community Design Center comes. So Bruce McCarty was an architect in town. He was the president of the AIA, local AIA, and so he brought the American Institute of Architects. And this fellow who was the president of the national AIA comes down and meets. So that's Margaret Gregg, and then that's a different person. I don't remember her name. But they come down and they form this East Tennessee Community Design Center, whose role, and that's a different history, but his role is to sort of provide consultation and assistance to nonprofits now, but at the time it was just community, and maybe still too now, just community members who want to do things to improve initially Fort Sanders, but also areas around Knoxville, and sort of meet community challenges from within. Because this is the era of urban renewal, right? And there's a lot of fear. This is part of the resistance to JCA or to Epworth that it encounters early on. So there's a fear that this is the spear point of urban renewal for Fort Sanders. That federal money is going to come in, they're going to bulldoze houses, they're going to change the character of the neighborhood in this sort of top-down federal way.
Kind of like neighbors saw what had happened in like the 30s through the 60s.
Right.
East Knoxville, and
right.
Fort Sanders was like, they're coming for us next.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, explicitly.
UT was coming.
UT was
UT took over all that property south of Cumberland.
Yeah. And even that's specifically mentioned. I think Bill Daniels in an article says, we don't want to do it like the area around the Coliseum that looks like it was bombed. And there's this group, the Fort Sanders Defenders. So this, I keep in, and this is a poorly structured talk. Keep going forward. Sorry. And there's a group called the Fort Sanders Defenders that was kind of part of the controversy around Epworth, and they were organized specifically as an anti-urban renewal group. And in the end, through initiatives like this, Epworth kind of turns the tables. Like they're on the same side. So they partner with the Fort Sanders Defenders in the end, which is a nice story. So the other big area of the Venn diagram, right, is this campus unrest. And there's a lot of activity with UT and with UT students, and particularly with these kind of activist and marginal UT groups. So there's a gay liberation front, which is actually kind of interesting to read about, and then I think about in the 1970s, a gay liberation front at UT that tried to get official recognition by the university and was denied official recognition on legal grounds. And then I think the plan was they were going to become part of the Student Government Association. I don't know how that story ended, but and through all that process, they were meeting at, I think it was in the Laurel Theater building. So they were meeting as part in the Jubilee, and you can see the little Gay Liberation Front poster. This is in the pick up a 1972 UT yearbook, The Volunteer. A lot of them are interesting in that era. The 72 one was great. It's like beautiful photography. There's really interesting stuff in there. So I recommend that year. And then there's this other fella who is really important, not really explicitly in Epworth, but in the campus activism in the era, called Peter Kami. So Peter Kami was a Brazilian immigrant, and he was involved in a long sequence of just campaigns and sort of activist activities at UT's campus that ended up getting him, I don't know if he was expelled, he just didn't re-enroll, but he got banned from campus, basically. He was legally banned from going to campus. And through all that process, the Epworth properties were kind of a place he could go, and he could, I guess, continue to do activism, but also meet with UT administrators. So there was a lot of kind of shuttle diplomacy, I guess, providing a middle ground between these activists and the administration. And people like Gideon Fryer, who's not really mentioned in the talk, but was an important figure in Epworth ministry and in UT in that era, were really involved in all that, because he was an important person later, the head of the College of Social Work at UT, and had a lot to do with Peter Kami. Actually ended up, if you look at his papers, he was sending him money actually when he was in Sweden. So closely associated with this fellow's work. All right, so this is the origin really of Jubilee Community Arts, is the arts programming and the festivals. So the arts is pretty early on. 1971 is the first NEA grant, so there's already interest in using the arts as a means of building community within Fort Sanders. Using the arts as for all the wonderful things arts are for, right? Providing people with a sense of sort of dignity about their cultural heritage, right? Because this is kind of connection to Appalachia. This idea that you have people coming in from Appalachia to Knoxville, which is sort of a strange thing to say in our modern sense of the term Appalachia. We usually think of Knoxville as part of Appalachia, but I think in the era, people would have thought of Appalachia as maybe somewhere that isn't Knoxville, right? So coming into the city of Knoxville is a way of in a way you kind of lose that connection to your cultural heritage, and there is a part of the justification for this program, part of the argument for this program is it allows people to reconnect with that cultural heritage, and the NEA supported it. So there was a lot of use of the facilities by student groups, and some of these student groups would go on to become, or some of the student groups, student performers. And this is a quote from Gideon Fryer, that a lot of these student groups were kind of not ready for prime time, and this is part of the function of the facilities, right? This is a way to get out there and perform and like work on your material and learn to do, learn to be in front of other people. Not really exactly what we do now, although we host bands to play for dances and stuff that aren't professionals. But that was a big part of its role with the student community, but also hosted a huge number of really important touring artists, which we'll have a list of them later. But like Gene Ritchie played in the 70s, which is quite very cool. I learned that. So that was part of the kind of the regular programming. But the big events that are the genesis of the Jubilee name even are the Jubilee festivals. So the Jubilee festivals began in 1969, and So that's from a Jubilee festival, and you can see I'm going back and forth. I've got two pictures. So there's this picture here of this tapestry, and there's it hanging. So this tapestry was kind of, I guess, what hung behind the stage at the Jubilee festivals, and we have it here, so you can come up later and look at it. So this was made by Margaret Gregg in 1969. She is still alive and was an important artist, and is an important artist, I guess. Visual artist and designer, and really, really important in influencing the aesthetic of early Jubilee Community Arts, and then went on and had a long career doing other kinds of art. Lives in Abington, Virginia now. So you can see, so these are the posters from these festivals, and I think all of these two are fully Marge Gregg. This was after she had left, but they obviously used some of the design stuff. So what were the Jubilee festivals? So the Jubilee festivals were multi-day, music festivals. So they bring together local and also out-of-town musicians but other stuff too. So they did craft stuff. They did some of the early ones, especially. They had like work sessions where they were sort of doing lectures and talks about rural poverty and all these other and civil rights and all these other issues. They had. I already said workshops, but I think the workshops are kind of interesting because that's something I'd like to bring back. And they had dances, and they would also go absolutely all night. I mean, some of the schedules from these would have like scheduled jam sessions that start at 3 a.m. and stuff. And they took place, again, between the two buildings, between the Jubilee Center and the Laurel Theater, and more at the Jubilee Center because it was larger. So usually you would have like workshops at the Laurel. And the other I guess controversy about them is when did they start? It's not, which I think Toby did a lot of work on. So my understanding is that from Toby's work, I think mostly, is that they started in 1970 is the first one, and it wasn't called a Jubilee Festival. So this is 1971, but this is like the first poster. But they were called other things. This is called Folk Music Fair or something like that. But retrospectively, we call them Jubilee Festivals. And then, but began organization in 1969. And then the nth annual kind of got out of order. So there were like multiple of the same nth annual a couple of times, and so you can't necessarily go on that. But the 50th one was in 2019. I think they worked that out as best it can be.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Be quiet,
yeah, what else to say? Nothing else about Jubilee festivals, I guess. But so again, that's the origin of a lot of the arts programming at these Jubilee festivals. The other, I guess, personality that had a big role in shaping the early arts programming is this guy John McCutcheon. So John McCutcheon became and is still a quite famous folk musician in the kind of the folk revival, but got his more or less his start in music, as far as I could tell, coming down to the Laurel, No. Okay. Well, yeah, okay. But he learned a lot. Is my point, right? Like he learned a lot of string band stuff. And while he was here, though, started the old harp singing. So old harp singing is something I want to talk about, because old harp. So it's shape note singing. Shape note singing is this tradition that goes back into the 17th century. Is this right? 17th or 18th century? Anyone know? Old harp. It goes back into at least the 18th, and it's kind of early America. And it's a way of singing. It's a way of group singing where the notes are represented by little shapes in the book, so you can sing it without reading music. And it's kind of atonal and interesting sounding. Anyway, there were shape note singing groups still active just in rural Tennessee at the time. So they went out and heard this group in Wares Valley, the Wares Valley Baptist Church, and John decided to teach the people in the Epworth congregation to shape note sing. So this is the origin of the Epworth old harp singers who sing from this group called the Sacred Harp of Columbia. Or the old harp of Columbia. Old harp. The new harp of Columbia. Okay, not old harp. The new harp of Columbia that was published in Knoxville and is used in local churches and local groups. All right, and so this is a Jubilee festival. This fellow was a regular, as far as I can tell, the early Jubilee festivals. Nimrod Workman, and then that's John McCutcheon. Nimrod Workman was interesting. He was a coal miner I think he was from Martin County, Kentucky originally, but worked in West Virginia and has June Apple, Apple Shop, all the connections. Put out a lot of his records of him singing ballads and things.
87 Jubilee Festival. 87 Jubilee was in honor of Nimrod and all that work.
Cool.
We have the recordings of that. Never been able to dumb them down.
So that's something I guess I should mention. Yeah, so since 1980, continuously we've recorded concerts. So we have an enormous archive of amazing music that's been presented in the Jubilee Festival, but also in the regular concerts that is not so accessible right now because it's on magnetic tape and stuff. But eventually we'll figure out something to do with it. I think they were going to send it to TTSU for them to keep and digitize. Okay, controversy. There's always controversy. So that halfway house I mentioned did not last long. It was close. I think it lasted about a year. One of the counselors was arrested for drug dealing, which is not ideal. I get the feeling, and again, people in the room were there maybe, but I get the feeling that some of these initiatives were a little bit. They didn't mesh well with unstructured, right? Like drug treatment maybe needs a little more structure, and also maybe didn't have the resources that they needed to pull it off fully successfully. the Fort Sanders neighborhood initially, as I mentioned, had a lot of trepidation about the Epworth people. So this is a little letter to the editor that was sent in about, or I think 1971. So the Epworth people are the worst polluters. Rock festivals polluted an otherwise quiet night with noise for 6 blocks. They didn't like how they painted the houses, that they were hideous and ugly, the marijuana, etc. And then, of course, it attracted the ire of Kaz Walker, as Kaz Walker has to feature in every Knoxville story at some point. So all this political, the political activism going on campus and so forth in the 60s got the attention of the conservative forces in Knoxville, as well as law enforcement, right? Because there was the Billy Graham Crusade in 1969, was it? Do you know? Was this right? So the Billy Graham Crusade came to UT, and then
with Richard Nixon.
Yeah, and there was a big protest, and several people were arrested.
There were huge protests.
Yeah.
And the FBI and the CIA were all over campus. There was a man who had long curly hair, and he walked around in a white robe, and he called himself Jesus.
Carol Bible. Yeah.
What were you going to say about him? He would walk around and like...
And he was closely watched by the CIA and the FBI.
Oh, they were all prosecuted, yeah. Including Carol.
So apparently, at least according to the Knoxville Journal and the Watchdog, they were also, the FBI and the TBI were also very interested in Epworth. so they made sure to surveil that organization on the grounds that it was sort of full of leftist subversive, which maybe it sort of is. So there's controversy. There's also a lot of accusations of blasphemy. That the only religious symbol in the Epworth church was a cross that said Jesus was a freak or something. I don't know if that's true. So there's that kind of stuff in that era. So Kaz Walker's also a big opponent of the Highlander Center and all that. And then there was a killing. So there's a man named Sanford Hance who was, so this is what I'm not, and maybe someone here can confirm this forever, but every police report says that it happened in the Epworth Church at the corner of 16th and Laurel. So the Epworth United Methodist Church was not at the corner of 16th and Laurel, right? That was the Jubilee Center at the Highland. So is Epworth Church referring to what we call the Laurel Theater now? Or is it referring to the building that the Epworth congregation had been meeting in, which was 1533, which is across the street? I don't know.
Renfro Sproul says that it happened at the Laurel.
Okay, so the Epworth Church meant, all right, so I guess that satisfies me.
There's a ghost and you're off.
That's why there's a ghost.
But what happened, so there's a man named William Collins who was employed as a handyman. He was mostly homeless, I guess, and he was living in the church, and he had this fellow Sanford Hance was over, and they were hanging out, whatever, and conflict ensued, and William Collins stabbed Sanford Hance 5 times in the chest with a knife, and he died, as one does. And so he was arrested, and I went to the court records. He was found not guilty, so it was not, according to the state of Tennessee, a murder. It was self-defense, I guess. But Sanford Hance was killed in the building, and maybe there's a ghost now of him. So all of this is not great press. So I guess maybe as a result of some of this, I don't really know why, but the Methodists pulled out in 1969. And of course, they are 1976, sorry, that's what I meant to say, 1976. And they were, of course, the main institutional kind of pillar of this whole thing. So I assume that means Renfro Sproul is gone then. I don't really know when because he paid by the Methodists. John McCutcheon and Margaret Gregg, who had been kind of the instigators of a lot of the artistic activity, had left by 76. I think they both left by 74. So that's kind of when Epworth ministry as an identity goes away. It's a little bit of a fall of Rome situation. Like, when do you mark the end of Epworth? Because the corporate entity goes on until at least 1991. Because that's when I found a letter from Gideon who says that it ceased doing business to the state of Tennessee in 91. Of course, the congregation keeps going, but there's some entity there still, but it doesn't really function anymore, as far as I can tell. And if you look at like newspaper announcements, it stops being Epworth Ministry blah 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 and starts being Jubilee Community Arts blah blah. So there's that transition that happens in kind of the late 70s. The Epworth building, which was the Jubilee Center, it's leased to Christ Chapel in 79. There's still Jubilee festivals in there. So I assume that the Christ Chapel people are using it during the week or something.
We're still dancing in there through 81.
Yeah. But it's sold so it's sold completely in 81 as far as I can tell. I get the feeling, and again, people who were there can tell me that the building was not maybe in great shape, and that's part of why it was the attention was directed towards the Laurel, because that building maybe had not been in great shape in the late 60s. And had,
Laurel wasn't in great shape.
Right. There's more salvageable, I guess. And of course, the Christ Chapel people they repaired it, but I talked to the guy who is the head, I don't know if they call him a minister, but whatever, the head guy there, and he said that they had to do a lot of work when they got it. So I guess it was maybe a little bit in despair. And they added on, so that the building now has 2 wings, and that second wing was added on by Christ Chapel. So restoration efforts kind of focus on the Laurel at that point. So JCA, we've been talking about Epworth Ministry. JCA existed this whole time. So it was incorporated. It was formed, I guess. It was incorporated in '69. And then it has a charter that was approved by the state of Tennessee in '79. And the charter is basically 3 groups coming together. So it's Jubilee Community Arts, or whatever it was called, its predecessor. The play group, which was a student group that did innovative theater stuff, and then Sidewalk Dance Company. So those 3 coming together form the thing that is Jubilee Community Arts today, according to the charter. But the JCA was formed, so the 3 names that are associated with the founding of it were Rich Kirby, who's an old-time musician, still around, Bill Daniels, and then Marge Gregg. And then, as I said, kind of in the late 70s, it takes over branding. Live at the Laurel begins also in the late 70s, which is a radio program.
We started in 1981.
Okay, I was there. Thanks.
Pete Jorgensen was the first host, along with me on occasion, and it grew out of talking with Paul Campbell in the parking lot of the Jubilee Festival when WOT canceled Folk Festival USA, which was a show. And so we decided to do Live at Laurel.
Very good.
That's Live and Laurel? Live at
It's
Laurel.
Live
That
at.
should be Live at.
That's it.
Yeah, I thought so.
And then I had this poster, one because I wanted to include, because I think it's my favorite poster. I love the weird repetition. It's fun. But also this is 82, I think. Is anyone going to correct me? I think this is 82. So this is the last one before the next event, the fire. And you can see it's all in the Laurel. So at this point, the Jubilee Center has been abandoned to the Christ Chapel people. So then we come to 82, Knoxville's Annus Mirabilis World's Fair. And the relevant thing at the World's Fair for Jubilee was this Folklife Festival. And so first, I would speak up for the Folklife Festival. Because back, I guess it was, how many years ago was this? 2 years ago when we did the 40th. There was a lot of retrospectives. And I feel like the Folklife Festival is always like a little bit of, and they did some stuff on the side, no one really cared. But the Folklife Festival was a big deal. I mean, this was the longest continuous Folklife Festival ever attempted. It brought in basically every traditional musician that I can tell who was active in kind of the Upper South in the late 70s, early 80s. So like everyone from, Etta Baker played there, and Tommy Jarrell and Albert Hash and all these really important people in all kinds of different genres. It created careers like the Five Blind Boys of Alabama really were discovered there. So big deal. And very important in folklife as a profession too. And well curated. And Hamper McBee was a hit. This is moonshine still there. So he was a moonshiner and a storyteller who they brought in. He was allowed to make 2 gallons of moonshine a day that had to be collected at the end of the day by revenuers, by the whatever. And apparently this is all in the Tennessee Folklore Bulletin, that occasionally they would consume a little bit too much of the moonshine and have to go up and buy new moonshine to give to the revenuers at the end of the day. But no one was supposed to drink it.
I did.
So they were not giving out samples?
No.
Right.
He would, and when you went to hear his talk, he would let you sniff it.
Okay. Because I remember that as an 8-year-old. I remember there being moonshine, but I know that I didn't drink it. But it was around, and it was.
Yeah, but no one.
Wasn't there something about kudzu being used as a food product?
Oh, I don't know.
Also at this Folklife Festival? Anyway, y'all will remember that.
Anyway. Yeah, and it was themed, so there were different like mini festivals with different themes, and there were interesting themes. Anyway, it was cool. That's my point. So Jubilee Community Arts, after saying that, was not formally involved with the Folklife Festival, but it was kind of at the genesis. So Bill Daniels, we mentioned, so he was part of the team that went to Spokane, Washington, which had the last World's Fair, and this is during the push. The people were thinking about having one in Knoxville. And he pushed to have a Folklife Festival. So he was kind of the motive force behind a Folklife Festival. And Van Cleek, who was the organizer, he wrote like blurbs for NEA, for Jubilee, saying that it was part of what fostered the interest in folklife in Appalachia and all that sort of stuff. So it was in the milieu, right? It's a little bit like the connections with Apple Shop and whatever. There was kind of the similar people, contributions back and forth in the cultural scene, even if it wasn't a formal role in the festival. So Folklife Festival was cool. I wish I was there. I was not born. But
the house that all the folk musicians stayed at, Beth Morgan, who was heavily involved in Jubilee, ran that house, and that's the one that had shine jars all throughout the kitchen.
So in the Annus Mirabilis, we have our disaster. So Friday the 13th, August 13th, there's a fire that in the Laurel Theater. So I love this new Sentinel headline because it gives a second billing to birds. So $3,000 a game birds, and then the Laurel Theater. This is even in the fire report that it was a coffee maker, the official fire marshal report, in the basement that apparently sparked and created a fire. So the fire it destroys or it heavily damages. Again, people here can speak to it who are there, but it destroys the roof, or at least really takes out most of the roof. Destroys a lot of the wall, the plaster on the walls. So the walls had to be replastered, and it takes out the floor, a lot of the floor, or at least heavily damages it. It also takes out the windows. Basically, it melts the lead on the windows, so the stained glass windows disintegrate. All of them can be at least partially saved, except for the big Civil War windows. That's why we don't have that window anymore. I've seen different reports. Either the fire department knocked it in, and that's how it was destroyed, or it was just destroyed in the fire. I don't actually know which. Well, I'll go to the renewal, the restoration. So, like these disasters are, it seems like it's a little bit of a mixed story. That maybe it was a little bit of a blessing, and as well as a huge. I mean, it was obviously a huge endeavor to put it back together. So if you were there at the time, you probably wouldn't think of it as a blessing. But in retrospect, it allowed them to modernize the building. So the original floor was sloped because it was kind of like stadium seating, like you would work for a church. And apparently it had some water damage, like the boards were kind of like a little bendy, which is not great for a dance space, right? So it allowed them to level the floor, get a new floor in. Install insulated windows, a newer, modern sort of shingles on the roof and all that sort of stuff. And the original plan was even to add back the steeple. So if you remember, way back here, it had a steeple on it. So that was part of the original design. That was removed in the 60s, I think, because it was leaking. And so the original plan was to put the steeple back. That never happened, and the roof still leaks. So.
I hope I'm right on this. I remember Tim Warman relating the story of the fire, and he said a fireman threw a brick through.
Yeah, that's where I heard that from Tim too.
So that's you can find Tim Warman and ask him about that yourself.
I rescued a cat that had been burned in the fire.
What?
There was
a cat.
And it had been burned, and we rescued it.
You rescued it? You were there.
And the piano survived.
Yeah.
So do you know if they threw a brick through the window?
Yeah. Do you know
That's what I've heard.
Tim claimed to have said, he was screaming, no, as the
He
fireman
claimed
was
it was
reaching back and ready to toss a brick through the window. To aid firefighting efforts, apparently open up the window so the water stream can make it through.
Because that is on the more accessible side there on 16th, yeah.
So that picture has Janie Wilson down at the bottom, Don Horton,
Right here.
Oh, yeah, that's not good.
Gideon Fryer.
Is that him?
Who's in the back
There's
left?
that one.
Looks like one of those guys.
I know
Irish band.
Ken Bronson is here, right? I think that's right. I don't know who these people are, and I haven't seen anyone. I think that's Sparky Rucker, and that's Guy Carawan, or Evan Carawan, I think. You would know. Is that right? Anyway, and that's some of the playgroup people, I guess, and all that.
Since you mentioned Sparky, he is finally being honored by UT, by the Alumni Association, as receiving an award for his long-term successes in preserving traditional music and art. Next month, actually.
It's about time.
There's a guy on the scaffold there, Kenzo?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of-
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So during this period, JCA offices, the offices are in the Bijou, and then there's programming all over the place. So some of the Bijou, the UT Music Hall, Knights of Columbus has some Jubilee festivals, and others like smaller venues. And then the restoration effort it's led by volunteers. They have to pay people to do some stuff, I think, like the roof. And this is the story that Paul Campbell told me, that there's convict labor that which I haven't found any written documentation of what they did or what that context is so that you get convict labor. But if anyone knows, but it reopened in '86. So it's Jubilee Homecoming. I don't know if that counts in the Jubilee Fest. It is in October, but a Jubilee Homecoming event.
There was no power. We had to run a line from across the street for that.
I think that, his name is Terry, and I just lost it.
Oh.
That previous.
Okay.
Oh, is that Terry Sherman?
Terry Schomer, isn't that Terry
Okay.
Schomer?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he is.
Okay, I guess I'm running low on time here. So post-fire, one really interesting initiative, and that Jubilee Community Arts was involved in, was this Tennessee Folklife celebration. So the Folklife Festival, and the idea was the Folklife Festival was the first one, the one at the World's Fair, and then the second one, so this would be an annual thing, would be put on by JCA at the World's Fair site. And it included a lot of the stuff that was at the Folklife Festival. So Hamper McBee, and they had canoe races and turkey calling and all that stuff. And a lot of regional musicians. I think Etta Baker played again, and those kinds of traditional music and arts, which sounds really cool. And I wish they kept doing it. But I assume that the fire kind of directed some attention away. And then there was a leadership change. So that's a little inside baseball, from Bill Daniels to Jenny Wilson in that era. And I think maybe the new regime wasn't interested. But in the 90s, then there's another return to the World's Fair site, and this thing called the International Jubilee, which I never knew about. I guess I was 1 to 10 at the time, so that's fine. But it's really cool that JCA put on this a big international folklife and music festival at the World's Fair site, and it was motivated by a newspaper, by the beginning of like an all-white bookstore in Knoxville in the early 90s, and the guy who started it said, Knoxville is the last great white city in America or something. And so the response of JCA was to put on this festival to celebrate the diversity of Knoxville's community, which is pretty cool.
It was an awful lot of work.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. It's like a huge amount of work and didn't really make any money. So other initiatives, I don't have anything about the Tennessee Folklore Society. I should. So the Tennessee Folklore Society is this thing much older than JCA, from the 30s, but was based at JCA from 1996 until just last year, and it's a really important organization documenting and publishing about folklore and folklife in Tennessee. Folklore Society, Tennessee Folklore Society is called. Another kind of folklore initiative from the 2000s was this Jubilee Records. They put out 4 albums of pretty cool stuff. So first, this New Harp of Columbia I mentioned, forgot the name of. So there's an instructional album of how to sing the parts. That's kind of cool. This is neat. The Pine Breeze recordings were made by students at a school for emotionally troubled youth in Southeast Tennessee near Chattanooga in the 70s. And they're amazing recordings of local old-time musicians and ballad singers and stuff. So that was put out by Jubilee Records. And then Johnny Ray Hicks, who was a ballad singer from the Hicks family, So this is all stuff that under the Brent Cantrell regime of executive directorship. And I guess Toby is probably involved in some of this too, maybe. And you can buy them all for a low, low price on Bandcamp. Go to Bandcamp. Okay. So this is just like, I don't know, slideshow, I guess, of who's played, or just some names, as we're getting low on time. And I'm happy to see, well, Lou and a lot of other people here, if they have any stories about any of these people. But this is kind of like core to the mission people, I guess. So traditional musicians from the region that played the Laurel, the kind of people that I get excited to hear about because I'm kind of that kind of nerd. So like the Hicks family of ballad singers from the Cumberland Plateau. Sheila Cadams is a still around, famous ballad singer from Madison County. They might work when we mentioned Charlie Acuff, who's a very charismatic as well as great fiddler. Lived in Alcoa, but was from Union County. Clyde Davenport, a long association with the Laurel. He's a fiddler and banjo player. All these people. And then a lot of folk revivalists. So people involved with the place like John McCutcheon and Rich Kirby. I love Gene Ritchie's announcement that I found in the newsletter because the first line is, yes, Gene Ritchie. Same response I had. It's like, wow, Gene Ritchie played the Laurel. So only once as far as I can tell, but in the 70s. So a lot of these people, Jeanette Carter, Retta Carter, it's kind of cool. The Laurel, but also the Jubilee Center. C. Con was involved. Red Clay Ramblers, love the Red Clay Ramblers. Doc Watson, that's a name. That's it. Alice Gerard and Mike Seeger and Hazel Dickens. And of course the Carowinds. And then there was a period, this is kind of the program, as the programming shifted in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a period where we had a lot of kind of big name singer-songwriter types. So Guy Clark played the Laurel, Iris DeMent played the Laurel, Lucinda Williams, Bill Frisell, it's kind of a shame, played the Laurel. Alison Krauss is I'm missing an S there, sorry. As a 15-year-old, is this right? 17-year-old played the Laurel. I also misspelled Beausoleil, but they played a lot. Ralph Stanley. Almost Townes Van Zandt, that's the story. So Townes Van Zandt died in 96, is that right? He died on New Year's Day, and he was booked to play the Laurel January 96. So he died just within a month of his Laurel.
I think the point to make here is that a lot of those people, when they played there, were not big name names.
Right.
I remember having dinner with Gillian Welsh and David Rawlings, where nobody knew who they were.
Yeah.
And Melody had got them to come over to Jubilee, and Iris DeMent and Guy Clark. I mean, they may have been known in Texas or wherever, but they weren't who they are today. So, I mean, it was really a venue to, I think, it's really important. Yeah.
So some of these, so Iris's show was actually an Ashley show.
Right.
So, but most of them were not.
Yeah.
So actually, we did a collaboration with Ashley Cass.
Yeah. So that's those folks. And then there's a lot of locals who play the Laurel a lot. And some of these are also big names outside of town, but put them on the local list. So Arby Morris, Harmony Mamas, and a lot of these people are still involved. And Don Castle, and I also have some et als because they just seem to play with a whole bunch of groups in a lot of different combinations. Nancy Strange, Brandon Strange. And then Steve Kaufman, who's over in, is that spelled wrong too? I really should check my names. Who's over in Maryville and does the Kaufman Camp, play the Laurel a lot. Tizzy Schmaltz, I love that name. I guess they're not around anymore, but there's a Klezmer band.
They're around as people.
As a band.
Manning left town. And Steve, regularly played with Red Rector, who...
Right, I should have mentioned Red Rector, yeah.
Was a real wonderful performer at the Laurel.
Yeah. Yeah, and Red Rector he's in the Country Music Hall of Fame as a mandolin player and stuff. And then international performers too. I didn't list them, but this is another thing that we do some of this still, more Celtic stuff. But it was like a lutenist, a Persian lutenist that played there in Indian classical music. And this is an interesting concert, an Israeli and an Arab, or maybe American Jewish, I don't know, an Arab performer. And Tanny Hill Weavers played in a benefit for the Laurel, and also just played last. To reconstruct it in '82, but also just played this last year. And that's all I got. So, thanks. If anyone wants to see the tapestry, feel free. I'll mention some stuff about the tapestry. I just think it's interesting, and you can look at it. I love the Amen, a woman. I think that's very of the era. And there's religious elements because it was a ministry, right? So you've got your little cross and stuff. And I like the little parrots at the bottom. You can see them over there.